Thank you all for coming. This is talk number 5 in Meher Baba of Ahmednagar and the Aesthetics of Religious Symbolism, a series of 10 biographical talks by Dr. James Newell, that's me. This is talk number 5, Travels to the West and Controversies from 1931 to 1939. And we may not go exactly up to 1939 because that's the must period. We're going to cover the musts next week. For those of you interested, I'm going to show 3 videos that I've done on Meher Baba and his work with musts that fit nicely with this, not identical to this, but fit well with it, I think. So, welcome. The plan for tonight's talk is to pick up where we left off last time, which is on the eve of Meher Baba's first trip to the West. Before we commence with describing this very active and in many ways momentous phase of Meher Baba's life, I want to review both a summary of what we covered at our last meeting, and I would also like to summarize both my overriding thesis for this project as well as my understanding of Meher Baba's motivations as he set off on this virtually unprecedented adventure to the West. And those of you who are uninitiated, I just want to clarify that what I'm doing is from the perspective of my academic training in the history of religions. So it's not what we call the religious narrative or the inner theological understanding of Meher Baba. It's how would somebody walking in out of the cold, knows nothing about Meher Baba, how would they see these things that he did, his behaviors, his experiences, how would he understand them from just an objective, we use what they call methodological agnosticism. So you're not talking in favor of what he says, not talking against what he says, just trying to make some kind of heads or tail out of it without actually entering into the whole belief system. So, if you recall, last time we emphasized the salient threads of Meher Baba's work during the period from 1922 to 1930. These were training of his, the threads were the training of his disciples or his mandali, learning how best to communicate he was developing means for how to best communicate his vision of cosmology. That is, cosmology means the structure and dynamics of the universe, the creation of the universe, and explaining to people spiritual development in relation to his cosmology, i.e. his trying to explain his religious narrative to others in a way that was attractive to them, made sense to him. And I'm not going to get into what I mean by aesthetics of religious symbolism too much, but the idea is that aesthetics is the study of beauty, and there's virtually every religious practice, there are symbolic elements to it. And my claim is that there's an aesthetic, there's something beautiful about the sacred that draws people to it. Not necessarily, in the old days, the anthropologists would say that religion and mythology was a failed science. They're trying to explain the world in a particular way, but it doesn't really explain the world as it is. I'm saying that that's wrong. That's not what religious people are doing. They're experiencing the beauty of, just as an artist gets a vision and creates a work of art from that, and people respond to the beauty of that. Likewise, religious specialists, people like Meher Baba, have a visionary experience of what the world is, how it's structured, and there's a certain beauty to that attracts people. So that's Reader's Digest condensed version of that. So he was also at this time preparing, from last week, preparing Mehrabad as a center for his work. So Meher Baba's primary emphasis during this period, I feel, was on teaching, i.e. on training his disciples, and this training consisted primarily in developing affectional bonds, and this is really the central work of everything he did. I'll say more about that as we go along, but developing affectional bonds with people, and this is very attractive to people and would draw them to him. And the second part of that, which I think really was secondary, was teaching specifics of his cosmology and his ideas of or his explanations of the spiritual path, including, and very central to that, was obedience to the master. So no doubt many of the specifics of the master-disciple relationship that Meher Baba taught his followers during this period would have been learned during his, or certainly observed and experienced by him during his years sitting with Babajan, as well as during the 7-year apprenticeship with Upasni Maharaj. Still, it's clear that much of his motivation and purpose in this work reflects his continued confidence in his earlier visionary experience, and in his confidence in his ability to fulfill the mandate that that visionary experience inspired in him. And we talked about that a lot last week. I'll say a little bit more about it today. So in order to explain that statement that I just made, I want to summarize both my overriding thesis for this project as well as my understanding of Meher Baba's general worldview as he entered onto this great expedition to the West, which is a pretty remarkable thing for, as we've gone through his life, for this little Meherwan Irani who was studying to be a good boy in Butler Mohalla, and then all of a sudden he's the toast of the people of Hollywood. This is unheard of on any level. So we'll get to that. So this is my general thesis, which I went into in the very first session. It's halfway. I figure it's a good time to reiterate that, not only because, just as a reminder, but we're entering into a period that's particularly fraught with experiences that are difficult for people to grasp when they first hear the stories about this. So I want to put this in perspective. So my thesis is that a young Indian boy of Persian ethnicity named Meherwan Irani had a visionary experience after meeting the Muslim holy woman Hazrat Babajan. This experience transformed his life and forever changed the way he understood himself and the world around him. This experience, coupled with subsequent guidance from his spiritual mentors, convinced him that he was fully what he called truth realized, and that's in his own words, or God conscious. As a result of these experiences and this conviction, Meherwan gathered a group of disciples around himself and came to be known to a small circle at that time as a spiritual master. Come on. I'll learn how to work. Okay. Now, after he gathered these people, they eventually decide on an affectionate name for him, and now known as Meher Baba, he's fully convinced of the importance of his visionary experience, his worldly mission, and the importance of what he called his universal work. He proceeded from that point to live the rest of his life in a way that he felt was congruent with and a best expression of this enduring conviction. And we went through a lot of different details about that, teased it out in many ways in the earlier talks. But particularly remarkable about Meher Baba was his absolute confidence in himself and in his work, a confidence which he displayed throughout his life. Another thing that was remarkable was his self-discipline and his complete focus on fulfilling and enacting this spiritual vision. These were equally impressive to his general confidence, which, of course, they were fueled by that general confidence. So, my claim in presenting this series of 10 talks has been that entering into the life and worldview of Meher Baba, his ethos, and the visionary realm of his religious claims can provide us with insight into a particular aesthetic of religious symbolism, which I just described a little bit, and of the human mythic religious imagination. And now that may sound, to people who are followers of Meher Baba, that may sound a little bit harsh to say that it's a mythic religious imagination, but even if you accept all of the claims of Meher Baba, part of those is that he operated as a human being and operated through his the personality that he was born into, and still had to operate his human mythic religious imagination in order to construct these narratives that he shared with people as he drew them to him and described or attempted at best he could, and he says even himself in God Speaks that it's impossible to describe these things. But so he had to use a very creative imagination to develop and construct a narrative that was understandable to other people. So, what was Meher Baba's experience? As we saw in an earlier talk, as early as 1918, Meherwan was writing ghazals in praise of his mentor, the Muslim holy woman known as Hazrat Babajan. In one such ghazal, he thanks her for transforming both his consciousness and his spiritual status. And this is a quote from the ghazal. "In the twinkling of an eye, you made a lover into God, and God I have become." Now I mention this because we look for, as historians, we look for empirical evidence of certain things. So this is evidenced, and it was published in the newspaper, that as early as 1918, he understood Hazrat Babajan both to be the agent of this transformation. His explanation of his own experience was this, that he had been turned from a lover into God, and that he already had a sense that this was the meaning of this transformative experience that he'd had. Marwan also spent a long time, and we went into all that with Upasani Maharaj, and during the final 6 months, this is Mayor Baba himself saying, during those 6 months, Maharaj and I used to sit near each other in a hut behind closed doors almost every night. On one such occasion, Maharaj folded his hands to me and said, Marwan, you are the avatar, and I salute you. So, this is another piece of empirical evidence from him, at least, his claim that even as early as 1922, he understood himself to be not only what he describes as truth realized, but also of a high spiritual status, effectively an incarnation of God, or to use Upasani Maharaj's Hindu term, the avatar. And there's a whole lot to be said about even the use of the word avatar, which we're just going to skip over for now. But if we assume that these statements express his conviction in his visionary experience and of his own spiritual state and status, I had a really brilliant thought that I apparently left out of that. But if we assume that, then we assume that he's operating from that worldview. So what was his world? We were just asking what was his experience. He describes his experience in that way. What was his worldview expressed through his teachings in this period? So in other words, he's been spending about, 22 to 30, so about 8 or 9 years, teaching his modeling, going through severe. One thing I haven't really gone into yet in these talks, which are an important element because there's just so much to cover, but is that during this period, and also a lot of these things many of you already know, but during this period particularly, well, even from the time Babajan kissed him, he went through just extraordinary ascetic practice. You can say practices, whether practices or just, he says at one time he was just on automatic pilot, but whatever they were, he would fast, not sleep, he would go into solitude, he would go into intense physical activity like walking for miles and miles and miles, and all that. But all of that being an expression of his understanding of these principles I'm going to get into. So, first one, and I went over these, I think, last week, but I'm shortening them up, but I want to reiterate them because they're important as we look at his work and his world travels. So, first one, and these are taking things that he expressed subsequently and using them to explain his worldview previous to when he actually articulated them. But this is from the Discourse on Maya. He says, the working of Maya expresses itself by making an important thing look unimportant. And likewise, in the same discourse, he says it also makes the unimportant seem to be important. So everything is turned upside down because of this principle of Maya. From the spiritual point of view, the only thing which has importance is God. People pursue their happiness through everything except God, who is the only unfailing source of abiding joy. So this is a part of his worldview. His activities, his teachings, and the way he is expressing himself is based on this principle, is one of my claims. Another principle, so from Meher Baba's point of view, the ways of the world, the opinions of the world, and of others are relatively meaningless and unimportant, as he says, when compared to his own visionary experience and the importance of his mission of teaching others about the reality that he experienced through that, what he said was a continual experience. The other principle is abnormal and supernormal, and he says this is from the Wayfarers, the Discourses on the Wayfarers. He says, according to one way of interpretation, madness is a deviation from the average mode of consciousness and behavior, and its degree, the degree of madness, is to be measured by the amount of its departure from the average pattern. So we have this average pattern. If you're below that, if you can't be normal, which is the average pattern, then you're below that, and that's how you discern that someone is mad. They're below that level. Madness is the incapacity of consciousness to understand or express, according to another way of interpretation, rather than being simply that you can't make it up to that level, madness from above that line is the incapacity of consciousness to understand or express truth. And its degree, the degree of madness, is to be measured not by whether you're normal, but the extent to which the person deviates from truth. So although others may think that Mayor Baba's activities, and certainly during the, well, ever since he kissed Baba John, there was, his actions seemed arbitrary, sometimes completely mad. Golmai, who's one of his closest disciples, when she first saw him, she said, "Who's that?" And the person said, "Oh, that's Shariarji's son." And she said, didn't he go insane? I heard he went insane." This was what was going on in the community at that time, was everybody just thought he was insane. His claim is that he was, had a supernormal, an above normal ability, capacity to understand and express truth. Although others may think that his actions are arbitrary, inconsistent, and even mad, this is due, his claim is that this is due only to their incapacity to understand or express truth. Elsewhere, he has also stated that truth is identical with God and that love is identical with God. So these are all principles by which Mayor Baba's behaviors, this is his claim, and I find it the most convincing explanation of his behaviors, is that he was, his fidelity to these principles is why his behavior seems to be below the pattern of normal on many occasions, and he's saying he's actually above the pattern of normal. So my argument in general is that Mayor Baba's actions during this period of the expansion of his ministry to the Western world were, from his point of view, fully congruent with his worldview, a worldview which was grounded in his original visionary experience, which he claimed was continuous. I'll further argue today that his work with his Western followers and others whom he attracted to him in the Western world was grounded in the training of his disciples, which took place between 1922 and 1930. In other words, there's essentially no difference in the training except for the personalities and the different cultural contexts out of which he was coming. The remarkable fact being that he was able to, again, this is this little boy from Butler, Mulholland, who had, except for the British people he would meet in the camp area, he had no idea how things worked in the Western world, I mean, in terms of personal experience. So this is just from, again, from the objective, empirical point of view, this is pretty remarkable that suddenly he decides, okay, now it's time to go to the West, and he's functioned not just well, but at a high level, even though he seems, it seems to me that he deliberately needles people with his apparent arbitrariness. So, that is to say, as I've just tried to say, that training his Western disciples consisted primarily in, as I said before about his Eastern disciples, his training consisted primarily in developing affectional bonds, teaching the specifics of cosmology and the spiritual path, including obedience to the Master, and given the cultural dissimilarity between the Western and Eastern followers, how this training was carried out was characteristically different from his training of Eastern disciples, though they were still essentially along identical lines. That's my sort of argument there. So, in the context of teaching and instruction, I want to bring in one more perspective from which to understand Mayor Baba's work. I also talked about this last week, and that is the idea of the holy fool is a term for a person who feigns insanity, pretends to be silly, or who provokes shock or outrage by his deliberate unruliness. This is a quotation from a book on the holy fool in Eastern Orthodox tradition. So someone who provokes shock or outrage by his deliberate unruliness. However, the term does not apply to all such behavior. Extravagant conduct may qualify as holy foolery only if those who watch it assume that what lies beneath is sanity and high morality and even pious intent. The Orthodox Church holds that the holy fool voluntarily takes upon himself the mask of insanity in order that he may thereby conceal his own perfection from the world and hence avoid the vanity of worldly praise. A further stimulus to such behavior, the author says, in the Orthodox view, may be as a comical, paradoxical form of spiritual instruction. Now, I'm not saying that Meher Baba was a holy fool, nor am I saying, as earlier I put him in a category of shamanic behavior. What I'm saying is that there's a category in which this kind of behavior, again, it's congruent with the idea that I brought up previously, that of not caring what the people of the world think, only his mission and only his fidelity to this vision of truth, and the idea that he has not only the ability to communicate this to people, but a responsibility to communicate it to people. So this is just a category of behavior that's typical in some areas of sanctified people or holy people. And I'm saying that a lot of this is applicable to some of how Meher Baba dealt with social situations as he went around working in the West. So, his Western ministry. The reason I've gone into detail and to once more review my thesis and conclusions regarding Meher Baba's experience and worldview has been to prepare the ground for a brief summary of some of the controversies resulting from Meher Baba's travels in the West and my own interpretation or understanding of them. So, however, before we enter into that discussion, what I want to do now is present a brief summary of Meher Baba's travels and work in the Western world during the 1930s, mentioning the controversies that arise on the way. By the way, this picture down here on the bottom was taken by Paul Brunton. Now, I'm not going to, Paul Brunton is someone I could spend a lot of time on in terms of the controversies, but there's so much with him, I'll mention him in passing. So as another part of it, we will benefit as well from reflecting for a moment on the trajectory of the career of Meher as Irani as a young man, as being a typical Zoroastrian lad growing up in the camp area of Pune. So, and again, we've been through this, but it's important to put this in perspective when you realize this little boy from Butler, Mohalla now is suddenly the toast of Hollywood. So at age 19, in the midst of enjoying the pursuits of his studies at Pune's finest college, he suddenly loses interest in his studies and by all appearances suffers a complete mental break, if not a psychosis. Approximately 9 years later, at the age of 28, he emerges from his apparent illness, lets it be known that he is now a spiritual master or Sadguru, and with the full confidence of an accomplished teacher, even though he dropped out and had spent a lot of time just wandering around apparently aimlessly, but he's fully confident that he's now an accomplished teacher, and he begins attracting followers and disciples to himself and sharing his teachings with them. So now, the period that we've reached, after a period of 8 years during which he has continued to draw more and more followers to himself, despite decidedly and often apparently deliberately erratic and arbitrary behavior, he decides to bring his message to the Western world. He does so with only 3 disciples with him. It's Rustam, Ali. Those of you who saw the video last week, I went into a lot of detail in this, so I'm not going to go into all that detail. But Rustam, Ali, and Chanji were the only people who went with him, and a lot of people were mad about that. One of them is this guy, KJ Dastur, who was a big, he was, according to Meher Baba, he's the reason that he kind of talked against Baba to Raphael Hirsch, to his Paul Brunton, and it's all kinds of things resulted from that. But again, he really was not interested in whether KJ Dastur liked it or not. KJ Dastur really wanted to go to the West with Meher Baba, and Meher Baba just completely slipped out without even saying goodbye to him. So, so he does this with only 3 disciples with him and only 1 primary contact, who is Meredith Stark, and in complete anonymity. He's 37 years old at this time. So, on the 1931, in September, Meher Baba sails from Karachi to England with Rustam, Chanji, and Ali on the SS Rajputana, and synchronistically just happens to be on the same boat with Mahatma Gandhi, who is interested in meeting him. He didn't show any interest in meeting Gandhi, but Gandhi wanted to meet him, so he went into Gandhi's cabin and met with him. There's lots more to say about that, but we're going to speed ahead because there's so much going on during this period. So he spends 3 weeks meeting new followers at the Devonshire retreat of Meredith Starr, who again we talked a lot about his visit to Toka, the Toka Prem Ashram, and stayed in India for several months, I'm not sure how many, until finally Baba got so tired of his behavior, he flattered him and told him how important he was to his work in the West, and he should really go there and start doing that. But he does set up the Staffordshire retreat, and Meher Baba goes there, meets many followers. He goes from England to Constantinople, to Milan, Genoa, and then to New York. And there's countless interesting stories intervening here, but I'm just going to keep going to cover his travels. So, and by the way, I'm using a chronology that was originally done by Dennis McCabe's wife, Marty McCabe, and I want to give her fair credit. I'm not, as I say, if I just went through with all the fascinating details, it would take a long, long time, and we wouldn't get to. What I want to do is show a pattern and a general arc of what was going on during this period, and give my interpretation to that. And I think at least if I were to go into detail on those things, I would continue to use this frame as a way to understand it. So then he goes to Harmon-on-Hudson for his first time in 1931, spends 1 month, either 1 month and 3 weeks, or 3 weeks, almost in 1 month, but it's followed by another week in New York. He attracts hundreds of interested people, including, of course, he meets this time Norina and Elizabeth and Malcolm Schloss. He'd been corresponding with Malcolm Schloss and Jean Adriel, and so meets many, many people there. And returns to India this is he spends most of the rest of the year in Europe, goes back to India by early 1932. So, in March of 1932, he makes his first, after he's been back in India for just a couple months, there's lots of the people who had met him were clamoring to see him again, and so he made his first public tour, and then he returns to England and he delivers his message to the West. What I'm going to do is jump out of this, just because it's so evocative, and play this well-known.
Train Meher Baba has come from India with a message to the West. He does not convey this message by speaking, but by his mere presence. When he wishes to communicate with people, he uses this board and points to the letters on it. My object in coming to the West is not with the intention of establishing new creeds or spiritual societies and organizations. I see the structure of all the great religions of the world tottering. The West is more inclined towards the material side of things. I intend to bring together all religions and cults like beads on one string and revitalize them for individual and collective needs. This is my mission to the West.
So that is somewhat edited. There's at least another paragraph or so to that message. You can find the full message in either Lord Mayher or in the new wonderful book, if you want to know about this period. All of Baba's messages and his publications during this period are documented very nicely by Sheila Krinsky and Ward Parks in the book Meher Baba's Early Messages to the West. It's also a wonderful collection of newspaper articles and things, some of which you can only barely read, but it's fascinating. The 1932 trip was, remember the first one was in anonymity, just a couple of disciples. This time it was, all the disciples who he contacted were allowed to contact the press, and there was not an organized, he had some prepared statements, but it wasn't an organized PR campaign. They just let the word be out, and it was sensationalized in a great many ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So, but after delivering that message to, to the west in that little park with C.B. Purdom. He leaves for New York, travels to Chicago, and leaves for the West Coast. As he traveled by train across the U.S., he continually promised to break his silence, eventually agreeing to do so. Everyone got very excited about this, and eventually agreeing to do it by radio at the Hollywood Bowl. And if you read carefully the stories of how this played out, it was always Mayor Bob was responding to other people. Oh, you want me to do that? Should I do that? Okay, where should I do it? You know, oh, Bob, we should get the Hollywood Bowl. Sounds like a good idea. So then they finally made it to this big thing, and he just, again, in the context of his sense of what's important and what's unimportant, and all these things I outlined earlier, this looks very differently. When we think of it in terms of normal PR, he totally botched the whole thing. So, while in Hollywood, he delivers his message to America. First one was Message to the West. This is Message to America at Pick Fair. Beautifully put together, lovely address to all these Hollywood people specifically about the film industry, but it's almost like the film industry part is like a veil. There's these beautiful statements that come out of that. And this is just one paragraph from that much longer statement. Again, it's in that book by Word and Sheila, and it's also in Lord Mayhair, and I think you can find it on the internet as well. So, this is Mayor Baba, some more than halfway into the address, he says, and he's talking about the film industry and what can be represented through the film industry. He's at Pick Fair in Hollywood, Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford, and all these Boris Karloff and all these people who were gigantic, Marie Dressler, all these famous people at the time are there listening to this. Then obviously someone else read it out, but the self, in fact, is a limitless, indivisible spiritual essence, eternal in its nature and infinite in its resources. The greatest romance possible in life is to discover this eternal reality in the midst of infinite change. Once a person has experienced this, one sees oneself in everything that lives. Now, he's describing here, if you're familiar with what we talked about with him describing his own experience, he's describing his own experience here. He says once a person has experienced this, or at least how he understood his own experience, once a person has experienced this, one sees oneself in everything that lives. One recognizes all of life as his life, everybody's interests as his own. The fear of death, the desire for self-preservation, the urge to accumulate substance, the conflict of interests, the anger of thwarted desires are gone. One is no longer bound by the habits of the past, no longer swayed by the hopes of the future. One lives in and enjoys each present moment to the fullest. There's no better medium to portray this than motion pictures. Now I've yet to see a motion picture that portrayed that. And also you can take this, I was tempted to take this final sentence off just because it's, not only is it a lovely, very poetic statement, but to me it resonates very clearly with what we've already seen him say about his own experience. And it's just in stark relief to all that we've heard about this, what little Marwan has gone, little Marog as his mother called him, went through all these many years before, that he would stand now in front of the most celebrated people probably in the world as the film industry is beginning to grow, and now talkies have started and all that. So the talkies started, and the one who doesn't speak comes to Hollywood. And again, the aesthetics of religious symbolism to me are resonant here. So he then continues on to circle the globe with travels to Nanking, China, Singapore, and then Bombay. Now remember, he told people that he was, I don't think I mentioned this, but he said, okay, well, I'm going to set up all that stuff. That'll be great at the Hollywood Bowl, and I got some things I got to do in China, and then I'll come back and I'll do that on July 13th, he says. And then he gets to the, now you also have to remember that Quentin Todd is the one with all the Hollywood connections, and he sets up all this stuff. He contacts all the luminaries in Hollywood, gets appointments with Mayor Baba, gets him to meet Mary Pickford, and she sets up this whole thing for him, and he arranges for the Hollywood Bowl because he's got all these connections. So he gets to Honolulu, and he tells Quentin, you know, I've changed my mind. I want you to go back to Hollywood and tell all those people that you've made all these promises to that I've changed my mind. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go over to China. So imagine poor Quentin. Quentin had a rough ride. I admire him a lot more than many others, just by some of the things he went through. So after he goes all around the way around the world, spends 24 hours in Bombay. Yeah, this is his first time circumambulating the globe. 24 hours in Bombay, giving instructions to close followers. Then he returns to Europe. He goes to Marseille, Venice, and Assisi. This is the period when he goes to the seclusion in the cave with St. Francis. Goes to Milan, Paris, London, Egypt, Sri Lanka, and then, again, he returns to India. 1933, the first Western followers are invited to India. 10 Western women and Quentin Todd. And I don't know if that was just to soften the blow that he had to go through in Hollywood, or, but he allowed Quentin to come along. They called to India on, again, yay, and the press is covering this, the Messiah. They always do scare quotes when they call him a Messiah in the press in Britain. And they said the Messiah's women are going to go with him for 6 months to India, and then all of a sudden he says, it's been 3 weeks, I think you guys ought to go home. And this not only is difficult for the women, but it creates this huge sensation. Oh, what went wrong? What terrible thing did he do to them? Or what did, what happened that he sent them back? Were they bad? Or, so this creates this huge humiliating thing for all of them, once again. But again, to soften the blow, this is April, and probably by the end of April, they went back. July 1933. Oh, coming to the best part, man. Thanks for coming, guys. Good to see you.
This is great.
Yeah, thank you. July 1933, then he goes on his fifth. It's only been 3 years. This is his fifth visit to the West. He meets with select Western followers in Portofino, the romantic time that people talk about in Portofino. He returns to India and then makes his sixth visit to the West in September. So this is just a couple of months separation. He goes to London, then on to a month in Spain in October, and returns to India. Now it's 1934, his seventh trip to the West, Paris, London, Zurich, then he returns to India. Now, I didn't write down the month here, but I know it was November, because that's when our friends Darwin and Jean Shaw met him in New York. So then on the 8th visit to the West, and his second world tour, he goes to London, New York, Hollywood, and this time in Hollywood, he's still apparently got people who hung on in Hollywood, and they start to work on this film project that we've heard so much about. 1935, in January, he leaves Los Angeles to Vancouver, Hawaii, Yokohama, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Colombo, and then returns to India and moves the ashram from Mehrabad to Nasik. And this is the beginning of the Nasik period that we hear about, when he has the Western women and everybody come. So 1936, October 9th, he visits the West again, London, Zurich, and Paris. In December, the Nasik ashram is established with, it had been a place where he worked and had an ashram, but now it's all this period that's been being prepared for these 20 Western followers. This is the period that when we hear about the Nasik ashram, usually with the Western people, it usually refers to this period. So that is what I wanted to do, is cover, that's only in 1936, but I want to cover mainly his flying trips back and forth to the West, and just constantly doing this. And during this period, there are many controversial things that come up. I've mentioned Brunton and K.J. Dastur, and there will be other figures. A big one, which I didn't get into because he's really from a later period, but this Colonel Irani, who is actually Mehra's Baba's beloved Mera, her uncle, I believe the brother of her mother, and he is just outraged that obviously both her mother and Mera are more interested in Baba than his objections to them following Meher Baba. So he begins to discredit Baba in the press. He writes a book. He has a lot of the text and the points that he raises in opposition to Meher Baba are very much inspired by the big John Bull article. John Bull is like Uncle Sam. For Britain, John Bull is like Uncle Sam. It's just an expression that is used to kind of as a metaphorical representative of Britain. And there's a magazine, a popular magazine, like like Life magazine, or there are no popular magazines anymore, I think. But in any case, it was that kind of a thing. And many of the points in the John Bull article are sort of lifted and borrowed and reiterated by Colonel Irani, and he set up wherever Baba would go, he would go there and then give talks against him. It's almost like he was, and as I've said before, Meher Baba, when he put in the trust deed and said that he wanted to have a tower built with all of his closest disciples' names on the tower, this man who would constantly dog him and constantly say negative things about him, his name was listed among one of his closest disciples. So I'm not going to say much more about him, though there's certainly much more to say about him. But I do want to cover at least 3 of the significant controversies that occurred at that time and that were, I think, representative of how things went. So the heavily sensationalized press coverage, much of it sarcastically caustic, and including the later Hatchet piece in the British magazine John Bull, that I've been mentioning about, which was concocted by Raphael Hearst, which is Paul Brunton. His pen name was Paul Brunton, and K.J. Dastuer. And second is this whole business of his breaking his silence in the Hollywood Bowl. And the third is the sending back of the women disciples after 3 weeks of a proposed 6-month stay, which caused, again, a lot of response in the press. So each of these, I feel, can be interpreted through the lens provided earlier, which is important versus unimportant, what the people of the world, the people in the press, the people in the social groups out of which all these disciples came, took one thing as being important, which is what people thought of you, just how you conduct business in general. They thought these things were important. Meher Baba is, my feeling is that primarily, as I'll go into in a minute, is that this was about his training of the disciples and testing the affectional bonds and whether they were, many people during these things would fall away after one of these controversies would happen, but the core disciples, people who, 30, 40, 50 years later, many of us had an opportunity to meet, stuck with him regardless of what he did. At one point, Baba said he was the avatar, and Anita Villard said, "I don't care if you're the avatar, Baba, I love you anyways." Because it should, they just reach a point. Part of my argument is that the reason the emphasis is on the affectional bonds, aside from the fact that he's already said that he feels that love is identical with God, or that God is essentially love, but he did that because that was his main work. He developed affectional bonds because he wanted people to stop questioning and stop being caught up in the evaluative mind and operate from the level of the heart. Not to abandon the mind, but to let the heart have the lead. So there's this myopic question of important versus unimportant. There's his description of the must state, which I think parallels anyone who's advanced, which is abnormal versus supernormal. There's what we call normal is only because that's the, as he says, the average. And if we don't make it up to that average, that means that we're abnormal. But if we are above that average, then the person who's on the average is also going to think that we look abnormal because we're not behaving the way everyone else does. And he certainly exemplified that in many ways, and certainly proceeded, whenever these things happened, he proceeded with just astonishing confidence, really. It's just, when you read the text and how people will be, oh, they'd be going crazy, blah, 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 and you say, so what? Had no concern about that. So, deliberately looking erratic or arbitrary as a teaching tool, I'm saying that he did that a lot, and people, if they had that affectional bond was strong enough, then his erratic behavior did not concern them. Oh, come on, this thing is working backwards for some reason. And finally, as I said, strengthening affectional bonds. All of this was for testing and increasing the affectional bonds that he had with people. So the press was quite sensational. This is just an example. There are many, 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 many more. Indian Messiah visits England. Bagpipes for the arrival of Indian. Notice the scare quotes. Indian Messiah, his arrival at the retreat at Devon. This is Kenneth Ross, and he's the father of Anne Ross, our local luminary. And so these are in Coombe Martin and Devonshire, and as are these, although this is from a picture of India. So this is the kind of press that he was getting. Indian mystic's finger signals preserved 7 years of silence. Yeah, so it's possible to read some of these, but you get the general idea of what. Now, to us it seems humorous or whatever, but this is all things that the early disciples had to endure. Some of them liked it because at least they were saying he was Messiah, but then when the press turned more negative, especially the John Bull and other articles, and when he would deliberately do something arbitrary, people would fall away. Many would become close to Meher Baba because of the sensational press coverage. They liked to be in the limelight. They liked the idea that he was a star and he was with other stars and all that. But when he declined to break his silence over the radio in the Hollywood Bowl, they fell away. Just recently at dinner, Tim Cullen was telling us that he knew Mrs. Phelps Stokes. He lived in New York for many years, and she said that she liked Meher Baba. He was a very nice man, but he just couldn't make up his mind. And this was, and it was specifically over at this event that she decided he couldn't make up his mind. She decided that, well, Sid's going to do this. And again, it wasn't just that he couldn't make up his mind, but that he would just blow off Mary Pickford. I mean, who does that? You know, this is very disturbing to people to be like. Well, I'm not going to get into what it would be like today. So the other one is that while traveling in the West during the 1930s. Each time Meher Baba made a significant announcement and then canceled his plans, it caused great confusion among the public and great humiliation and embarrassment among his devotees. And these are some of the women disciples who went with him in 1933. This is one of the headlines: Messiah's girl disciples reveal their plans. They're going to travel to lots of things about how he's going to travel with them to India. They're going to stay there for 6 months. And then, of course, after 3 months, they just, he cancels the whole thing, and he doesn't lose, he's very, very, see, again, when this happens, he's very sympathetic, he understands how upset they are, he says, you know, it's important for you to just, you know, follow my orders, and he's continually writing these very mushy love letters back and forth with them, and they're very, you know, blah, blah, we want, they write back to him, so we want, and so then he comes back and sees them very quickly. Now, if he'd said, you know, well, you're going to go for 3 weeks, and then I'll be back and visit you in July, they would have taken everything in stride. It wouldn't have been a big deal, but he was kind of putting them through a lot. And again, my argument is that he's doing this as in the same way that he would teach his Eastern disciples. If he told the Eastern disciples, he would put them. Well, for example, one of the things he did with Vishnu, who was one of the closest. I mean, Vishnu just had absolute, unquestioned adoration for Meher Baba. And so he wanted Vishnu to run up the hill and tell somebody something. He had some message for somebody, but he didn't have his chopples. He said, "Oh, Baba, let me go get my." He said, "No, I need you to do it right now. I'm going to get your chopples. Just put my chopples on." And it's caused a huge distress in Vishnu because he's a Hindu. For him, there's no question that Meher Baba is the Sadguru, that he's identical, he's the incarnation of Vishnu, and he just refused to put it. So Baba says, so you respect my chapels more than you respect my order, and this is his whole. Now he wouldn't have done that with the Western disciples, because that's not something that would have upset. I mean, they may have been a little concerned, but they say, okay, whatever. But there's this whole culturally conditioned thing in Vishnu that to put on the master's chapels was just, he would rather die and fall into the dust, and he practically did. And I don't remember the resolution of it, but the point is that he responded to the cultural and personal needs of the individuals he was working with, not with some set plan. So, as I've already said, each of these events, each of these controversies can be interpreted and understood through any of the lenses suggested earlier, either important versus unimportant, abnormal versus supernormal, deliberately looking erratic, or arbitrary as a teaching tool, strengthening affectional bonds. It seems clear to me that all of these suggestions apply to this situation to one degree or another. In other words, he certainly had this worldview where he was focused very much on what was really important, not what was unimportant. He also was kind of role-playing that for people so that they could see what was really important. But that really only worked because of the main activity that he was involved with is like, I'm calling it strengthening of affectional bonds. So it just means he was very loving, he would make these connections with people so that they would become attached to him. And we heard constantly from the Monley that even a period as difficult as the New Life, that I've heard Erich and Mani and probably many of the others, but say that we didn't really care. If it meant that if we didn't do this, we couldn't be with him, we would rather be with him. If people say, oh, it must have been so hard, Erich would say, it wasn't hard because he was always there. We was always focused on him. So they had this affectional bond with him that was so profoundly deep that they never asked questions about these things. They may have found it difficult to do it, and there may be personality things that would come up, but it would be an involuntary reaction, not a voluntary one, because they always went for maintaining that personal bond with him. So, so it seems clear to me that all these suggestions apply to one degree or another. I personally like to emphasize the teaching tool way of understanding these apparently arbitrary behaviors. As Meher Baba has stated later in his ministry, true love is no game of the faint-hearted, for the faint-hearted and weak. It is born of strength and understanding. And so even if, now there's another perspective from which to look at this, even if half of what is reported is true, before this visit to the West, Meher Baba had spent the better part of the previous 2 decades undergoing astonishingly severe ascetic practices of fasting, silence, solitude, physical labor, and various intense activities. In this light, it seems that he showed impressive patience with those in the bourgeois world in which he found himself while traveling in the West. And there's many other ways to look at all these things. It seems to me it's most of the people who follow Meher Baba just accept, well, this is, and you hear in the stories, someone says, well, we know that that's how he works, or we know that that's his way. And that works for someone who's already established that affectional bond. But other explanations are needed for someone who's not yet or is never going to establish that affectional bond. So I'm interested in, these are kind of my responses to understanding. I'm interested in what anybody else thinks about that or how they interpret those things. So as I suggested earlier, my own assessment of this period is that his work with his Western followers and others whom he attracted to him in the Western world was grounded in the training of his disciples, which took place between 1922 and 1930, which is what we covered in the last period. For me, I understand this being a very deliberate attempt to attract disciples from the Western world while simultaneously introducing them to the seriousness with which he took his own vision of reality and his own vision of the spiritual path. Although his work with them was adapted specifically to the temperaments, personalities, and cultural nuances of these new disciples from the West, during this period, Meher Baba worked with them in much the same way as he had done with his Eastern disciples. And as I said, I'm interested in what your thoughts are on that. Anyone? Yes?
I'm in the photograph back a few slides of the girl disciples being sent back. Go one more. Yeah. Okay, that's Elizabeth on the far left, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, I just think it's worth noting that of these girl disciples who were sent back,
Yeah.
there were a number of people, I can't tell quite who everyone is, but who were not a bit deterred by this and who stuck with him for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, and this one on the far right is Jean Adriel. This is Kitty. This is Delia. This is Ranu.
Okay.
This is Norina, and that's Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I tried to, I mean, I just Googled and looked for women in 1933, and this is what came up. So I think, and it was labeled as that, so
Yeah.
I think those are the ones. And Jean Adriel certainly was in that group at some point. They look older than they were in 1933, so I don't know that that's an actual picture. But all those, certainly Kitty, Ranu, Delia, Norina, and Elizabeth were all there. I don't know if Jean Adriel was at that time. Anyone?
It
Thoughts?
seems,
Yeah.
it seems like, I'm thinking particularly about controversies in the West. It seems like there's like two things going on. One, drawing individuals to him through personal contacts were very meaningful. And the other was the sort of the PR aspect of it all. And just two thoughts occurred to me. Baba cared nothing about the impression at the PR level, which got counterintuitive to us, because that's such a big deal. And that if it had a significance for him, it was to try these Western disciples and test them, but otherwise it had no real significance. Is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it certainly, he was not concerned. He was, clearly, I think, he did want, for example, we've often heard, Zoe and I have often heard from Darwin Shaw, the story that he, and I think it was in 32, when all this, I mean, there was all this big press everywhere. And he just, in his Schenectady newspaper, saw this one little blurb, and he went, this, it just was immediately said, could this be the one? Is what he would say. He was expecting Christ to come. He said, could this be the one? And he kept watching the paper, and then something said that, he's coming at this date, he'll be at this place. And so my point is that although it went all over and hardly anybody responded the way Darwin did, had they not done this massive thing, he might not have seen that.
Right, so it drew people, but in terms of the controversies, the things that you might say went wrong.
Yeah, right.
And got highlighted.
Yeah, and he never, he, for example, things like, and this is, I'm not sure if there's an example in this particular period, there must be, but during the period when Colonel Irani would put out these really scandalous things. Well, even though it's true with the John Bull story, they said, it was interesting, the way it appears in Lord Mayor, he says he's talking with them, and he says, well, my work will work in a number of ways. It could be this way, could be that there'll be a lot of negative publicity will come out about me, or he had a list of different things. And almost immediately, someone got a report, and this is a good thing, he said, because it will do so. I don't remember what he said exactly. And then immediately, a phone call came where someone comes in and says, this big, terrible article has been published in John Bull. And all the disciples go, oh my God. And he said, well, we were just talking about what a good thing would be. Why are you getting so upset? He said, well, we need to respond. We said, no. Let it go. He did no response. Same thing with Colonel Irani. Over and over, the Audi wanted to go beat the hell out of him. But they wanted them to say something in response, and they'd say, no, that's not true. And he said, no. leave it alone. Yes?
Seems to me that it's not only a question of a kind of indifference to public censure, but that Meher Baba purposely courted a career which is not amenable to entry through rational mind. Anyone who tries to approach Meher Baba primarily through reason or through rational mind can't help but come to the conclusion that he was utterly crazy. And future generations
I agree.
will also come to the same conclusion, which shows me that unless Meher Baba's got something up his sleeve that's going to so powerfully counteract against the way he lived his life in such a way as to create such a poor showing for himself, that unless he manifests, for example, people say, well, he doesn't have to break his silence. But the fact is he does have to, because he's got nothing else going for him. He's going to go back down in a footnote of history as this charismatic figure who created quite a lot of interest and then disappeared into nothing but a footnote. Because unless Meher Baba delivers on the goods, he's finished. And we may continue to believe in him, but we are just...
Well, imagine let me see, how many years ago did Meher Baba pass away?
Almost 50.
50 years. So imagine 50 years after crucifixion of your master. You say, well, you better get been crucified. What more of a condemnation do you want than that? The point is, and this is a typical thing, remember I'm talking about the aesthetics of religious symbolism. If we take what he did and said concretely, yeah, so there's that, and there's also, we're leaving out the question of something he says in his Discourse on the New Humanity, where he talks about mankind has moved from instinct to reason.
Well, not instinct,
No.
it's to do with sensation. Instinct is, he never used the word instinct, that's a big mistake a lot of people make.
Okay, sensation to reason, whatever. Point is, sensation to reason, reason to intuition.
Right.
And the point is, what your statement about no one comes to him through reason is, emphasizes that people come through him only through intuition, or through the heart, or however you want to.
Well, unless someone has a direct personal experience that counteracts the so much legislating against Meher Baba. On Meher Baba's deathbed, a few hours before he died, he communicated, am I really God, or am I just a crazy old man? That's been taken out of the tradition attempted to be by Elizabeth. But when Adi K. Irani came here in 1970, I was here and heard him say that one of the things that Baba did on his deathbed is he said, am I really God, or am I just a crazy old man? Elizabeth called him in, apparently, and forbade him ever to speak about it again. He never said yes, he never said no. But in fact, he clearly said that. And to me, that's a beautiful thing, because with Meher Baba, if you study him assiduously, that's the main question. Was he really God, or was he a crazy old man? So,
Or a crazy young man. Yeah.
Or a crazy young man, when he was young, absolutely. And no one can not keep asking oneself that until one's faith becomes so profound that totally transcends reason.
Well, I'd like to see any other crazy old man who produced the body of work that he produced. See, when I was talking about this is part of the whole argument that I'm presenting here. When you get to follow these things down, the arguments just don't hold. The argument for him being a crazy old man doesn't hold up. The argument for him being a holy fool holds up, and that's exactly what the holy fool would say on his deathbed. You know, am I just a holy fool, or am I just a fool, or am I a holy fool? That's kind of the question beyond death. But again, that's in the Christian church, they always talk about this is the question of faith. You know, if he just kind of, wine bottles springing up on everybody's table because he's turning water into wine everywhere he goes, then everybody says, okay, good. But then they say, oh, I prefer white wine. So people are never satisfied. But so there's an element of faith that would be destroyed if there was some confirmation. And also, again, if we go back to what I'm saying is his worldview, where the unimportant is important, the important is unimportant, and likewise the normal and abnormal, those things get turned around. So and again, I'm sure Audie and Elizabeth, Elizabeth didn't want to have, she had enough stuff to deal with at that point, but any of them if it turned out, if you could prove empirically that he was, I mean, Audi used to say that, if Meher Baba's in hell, then this is where I want to be in hell. Heaven would be hell without Meher Baba. This is what Audi K. Rani used to say. And they all say that. The affectional bonds were so strong with all of them that if he's a crazy old man, okay, I'd rather spend the rest of my life with a crazy old man. That's
But future generations won't have whatever, at least we don't know that they will, whatever created that incredible bond with them, the physical touch. So we have to have such a profound change in the nature of consciousness that they'll be able to approach Meher Baba and get out of him that he was the avatar.
Well, first of all, again, I've had this discussion with you before, years ago, but there's always going to be people in the first most human form. So if you look at every single avatar, if we enter into Meher Baba's religious narrative, and we talk about all of the avatars before, none of them have been accepted by everybody.
Right.
That's just not going to happen. I mean, there's all these traditions about, oh, there's going to be a golden age, everybody will be enlightened. Even if everybody's enlightened, there's still going to be people in the first most human form. All our dogs that we used to have, all of all the monkeys in the forest, eventually they're going to take human form, and they're going to be a pain in the ass. That's just the way it's going to be. This is my. If you take Meher Baba seriously and you go by this, there's always going to be somebody who's just the first human form, and they're show me what to do. Give me your wallet. So there's that, and there's also this whole business of if we take him seriously and we really are moving from reason to intuition, then the more people that move from reason to intuition, the more people will be touched intuitively by, I mean, there's just thousands and thousands of, there's already, 5,000 pages of very, very touching stories in Lord Meher and elsewhere. And as I say, my argument here is that his life and the way he lived it in congruently to his vision has something that is aesthetically pleasing about it. His view of the universe, his existential experience of it, the absolute vigor with which he pursued the expression of this vision is aesthetically beautiful to me and to many others, and I think it will continue to be. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Anyone else? Thoughts, questions? I'm gonna get home before.
Just all those trips that Baba took, was it boat and then plane?
Well, all of those in the 30s were boat, yeah.
Boat.
He didn't take a plane, I don't think, until 52.
Okay.
I'm not certain of the date, but all the 30s were boats, yeah. That's a lot of boat riding. But if he had Durham, I mean, that's a lot of time.
Yeah.
Are we done? Thank you all very much for coming.